I'm Summer Hickman and I'm here with Sarah Jones. We just have a few questions about your line of business. What is practical bereavement support?
Okay, so practical bereavement support is the thing that people need really when somebody's just died or when there's been something major happen in their lives, and suddenly you find yourself having to contact lots of organisations and dealing with lots of paperwork. If someone's died, you've got to contact pensions people and the utility companies and house insurance and car insurance and all sorts of things that we maybe aren't thinking about at that time because our main focus is the grief because someone's just died. But all of those things need to be done, and if they're not done, then your money gets stopped, or the mortgage stops being paid, or whatever. So it's really important to get all those things done, but people just aren't in an emotional place to be dealing with that. So I just go in and work with people in their own home to help with that, basically.
Okay then, so could you give me an example of how you would help a particular person?
If I use an example of somebody that I've recently worked with, so she's a lady of 80 who's got quite poor eyesight, and as with a lot of people from her sort of generation, she didn't have anything to do with paying the bills or the finances or knowing who the insurance was with or anything like that. So as well as having to deal with the fact that she's been caring for her husband for the last couple of years, so she's just exhausted anyway. Suddenly she's got all of these, she knows she needs to phone a few places and phones the pensions people, but that's never the end of it, because the pensions people then send a form and they contact Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, who also send a form. So she'd lanced up with all of this paperwork that was just really stressing her out. So I went in, and as quite often is the case, we sit at the dining room table and I just say, okay, bring out all this paperwork that feels too scary to do, and I just look through it with them and we prioritise what needs to be done. A different customer recently, the first thing that made me prick up my ears a bit was the fact that she was still driving her deceased husband's car. Now that's fine, but of course it was in his name, so suddenly she's actually driving it illegally, so we made that phone call first.
Yeah, of course.
So you just prioritise and do whichever things most needs to be done for that person until that paperwork is done and it takes the weight off of them, basically.
Sarah, you're also a grief recovery specialist. What is grief recovery?
Grief recovery is a guided self-help programme, really, to help people that are struggling to move forward emotionally after they've experienced a loss. And a loss, obviously the first loss we think about is when somebody dies, and of course that is a huge loss. But also we have that emotional unfinished business sometimes with other losses. So when we've had to move house, or we've lost a job, or our health has really deteriorated, suddenly we lose the ability to be independent maybe. So all of those things affect us in a similar, or can affect us in a similar way. So the grief recovery method is a sort of guided set of steps that I take people through over an 8-week course to help them to identify the bits of kind of unfinished emotional business around whatever that was, whether it was the person or the job or whatever, and find a way of becoming complete with that, so that instead of that loss holding them back, so that they find it really hard to move forward or to sort of feel happy again, they then can kind of put that to rest and move forward. It's a brilliant idea. It was a guy in America came up with the idea 30 years ago after his very young son had died, and he found nothing that anybody said, albeit everyone was very well meaning. People said lots of what they thought were helpful things, but actually nothing helped, and he was in a very, very bad place emotionally. And he started to search for things that might help, and just found lots of practical steps that helped him. And people started coming to him and saying, could you speak to somebody else that's child's died or whatever? And he thought, I'll put it in a book. And that was 30 years ago, and the grief recovery method has come out of that book. So there's lots and lots of people that have been helped by it. But it is a very simple process. So that was why when I heard about it, I did a lot of research into it and thought, yeah, this is it kind of ties in with my practical approach to helping people with paperwork and stuff. This is a practical way of helping people to deal with emotional stuff that is, sort of stopping them from moving forward.
I haven't heard of anyone that offers practical bereavement support. Why did you set up your service?
Well, when my dad died, and I started helping my mum deal with all the paperwork and making phone calls to different organisations, a lot of things she was going ahead and doing herself, of course, like phoning the pensions people. But then she'd be very frustrated afterwards because they'd have asked her questions that she didn't really know the answer to, or they'd then have sent a form that they wanted her to fill in that, my mum's never filled in forms, she's never dealt with finance. So I started to realise how stressful it was for somebody when they're grieving to be dealing with things that either they haven't dealt with before, or even if they have, they've just not got the energy to be dealing with it. When we're grieving, we don't sleep as well, so our attention span and our ability to concentrate is sort of lower than usual. We're emotional, so that affects whether or not we want to be speaking to strangers and telling them that, telling some strange anonymous person on the phone that our husband's just died and that's why we're making this call. It's all just very difficult. And having seen how my mum reacted to all of that, I just took over and did all the paperwork. That was fine. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, who helps people that don't have a son or a daughter that lives nearby that can do it for them? So when we'd finished dealing with all of my dad's sort of affairs and paperwork, I just started searching, just out of interest really, just to see, who helped. And I thought Age UK or Cruise or somebody like that might do it. And they all produce very helpful booklets that advise people who they need to phone, which is of course useful, but that's not the same as somebody sitting with them and saying, okay, let's look at all this paperwork that's really stressing you and let's do it together. Let's get all those phone calls out of the way this afternoon, so that then they feel that relief of that thing's been done, that they've been worrying about, and they've not had to do it. So that, it came from that very simple idea that I couldn't find anybody else that would have helped my mum if I hadn't have done.
What work did you do before this, Sarah?
For the last 20 or so years, I've worked with either families or children at a point in their life when things are going badly. So I've done a lot of work with Women's Refuge service in Ipswich, so when families have fled domestic violence or domestic abuse, they land up at a refuge and, okay, they're safe, but that's it. They don't know anybody in that town, they've not got anywhere permanent to live, they've quite often left all their possessions and all their children's possessions. So I've done a lot of support for those families when, as soon as they get allocated a house by the local authority, which often they generally do, they then need help to start from scratch really and set up accounts with utility providers and get house insurance and find furniture and just all those practical things, register their children at the nearest school, lots and lots of practical things that they've maybe not had to ever do and certainly never had to do it all at one time before. So I've done a lot of that type of support. I've worked with a lot of children who, for whatever reason, can't live with their parents, so they're maybe in foster care or in children's home, and they face lots of problems. And so I've always supported people at a time in their lives when they're struggling and they need somebody to just kind of, I often think of it as walking alongside them or holding their hand, not literally, but it's that having someone to do those difficult things with and helping them to find information so that they make informed choices. We often don't know what it is we could be doing or what services we could have or what options we've got in terms of going to college or something until someone says, well, you could look at this or you could look at that. So that's what I've done for 20 or so years. So this feels like a kind of natural progression from that, because it's again about people that are in a difficult time and they need practical support. It's that simple really.
You're a bereavement specialist, but can you help people in other difficult situations?
Yes, I can. For example, a guy that I've recently been working with, that was because he was terminally ill. He has sadly now died. But at the point that I started helping him, he could no longer work because of his terminal illness. He was way too unwell, and he'd had all the sort of sick pay that he could from his company, and then after a while they are allowed to sort of dismiss you because of ill health. So he still had a mortgage to pay. He was early 50s, he still had a mortgage to pay, but he's got no income. He absolutely can't earn anything. So he heard about me, and through a friend got in touch with me. And the first thing we did was look at the fact that everywhere he'd ever worked in his life, he'd had a company pension. Okay, they weren't necessarily huge, but they were pensions that he wasn't entitled to yet. But because once you're terminally ill, you are entitled to those pensions. So we helped him to access those pensions, and he got those lump sums. So he was able to just live comfortably financially, because the worst thing I could think of when I first heard about his situation was the idea that you're dying, you're constantly going backwards and forwards to hospital to have chemo, and that makes you really ill anyway, and you're worried that you're going to lose your home. That was just such a horrible idea. So I started working with him, and I've since worked with other people in a similar situation just to deal with, again, all the stuff that they need to, but they're not able to, they're not well enough to do it, but it needs doing. So yeah, it can be any situation really.
If someone needed to contact you, how would they do that?
Well, they can either go to my website, which is www.sarahjonesadmin, spelled exactly how you think it is, .co.uk, or my mobile number is 07702 454491. You can either text me or ring me on that. So I think my message is, if you're in a really difficult situation and you think you need some help with the phone calls and the paperwork, give me a call and we'll have a talk about it, and I'll see how I can help you.